Good morning and welcome again to Word of Faith Response. And thank you again for listening to us. We have been sharing with you the wonderful things that Jesus has done in our lives at the Word of Faith Fellowship. And today I have Dayle English with me. You have heard, maybe if you were listening to our prior programs, her husband share. Her husband's name is Joe English, and he was involved in the music industry, and he shared his testimony. Not only was he involved in that industry, but he was also formerly a drug addict, and God has miraculously delivered him. And so now you get to hear from Dayle English, and she has a powerful testimony as well. And she was in the music industry herself. That's where she met Joe, and she was involved with some other singers that are well known. And you're going to hear about the lifestyle that was taking her down the wrong path, but miraculously Jesus came and met her and transformed her life. So let's listen as Dayle shares. Dayle, go ahead.
Good morning, Rutherford County. It's so good to be here, and I really appreciate this opportunity to get to share my testimony because it is so powerful what God has done for me and for my family. I just want to say that the main thing with my testimony, and I'm sure you'll understand as I go on, is it is a testimony of the mercy of God. And it's also an encouragement to those of you that are praying for loved ones that it just seems totally hopeless. So I want to start way back when I grew up. I was born in Pennsylvania, actually, but I grew up in Florida. We moved down there when I was 9. And my dad bought a small cattle ranch, and of course I loved that because I love being outside. And I finally talked them into getting me a horse, and so that was the beginning of all my horseback riding. And I mean, I threw my whole heart and soul into it until I became a teenager. But to back up just a hair, a lot of my problem started out with drinking alcohol. And I was around a lot of, quote, social drinking growing up because my mother was very social, and that was the way they started all of their gatherings, is they'd have a cocktail. So I was around alcohol all the time, and that was just normal to me. We didn't really go to church. When we moved to Florida, there was a drive-in church across the street where you'd pull in your car. It was an old drive-in theater, and you pull in your car, you put the speaker on your window and listen to the service. Well, my brother and I didn't listen to the service. We sat in the back and played with stuff, and they tried to keep us from getting in arguments. It was not a good situation. So anyway, that was it for me as far as church. And then, I went through school. I think they really graduated me from high school because I was so much trouble, and they wanted to get me out of there. But I was a mess. I mean, we did stuff like bring our horses to school and ride them up and down the halls. It was a one-story school, with cement floors and everything because it was Florida. But, I mean, it was, we were wild. So anyway, after I graduated high school, I did one quick semester at a college in Mississippi at this high-level girls' school, Belhaven. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but they were going co-ed at that time, and I never went to class. I mean, I might have gone to the first day of class, but that was it. So I didn't make it through my first semester, so I went back home. And at that point, I got a job in a bar, and I met, I met Dickey Betts, who we had actually grown up together, but we didn't know each other. I mean, it was literally less than a mile apart from each other out in the country, and you usually know everybody, but I didn't know him. So anyway, we met. His band was playing in the bar, and so we kind of hit it off, and he and I started dating. And then we went from there to starting our own band, and I learned how to play keyboard and sang, and he, of course, played guitar and sang. And so we traveled around and did club gigs, I call it, and we ended up in Jacksonville. But let me back up to where we were at before that. We didn't have a car, so we bought a Harley-Davidson motorcycle. And so one night, Dickey was out riding around on his motorcycle, and he was drunk. And the police pulled him over, and he made the mistake of saying, "I didn't see your siren." So he went to jail, and he lost his license. So we didn't have anything to drive. So guess who gets to ride the motorcycle? And Dickey on the back. And he loved that. He thought it was great. All our friends thought it was great. Look at her riding that big Harley, But it was, it was a path to destruction, to be honest with you. And so then we eventually got married, and we had a daughter. And at that point, we were in Jacksonville, and I had met Dwayne and Greg Allman in Birmingham, Alabama, doing something else. And so they heard about our band, and we were playing in a big club there that was owned by the mafia. And so whatever they said, we did, But so anyway, Dwayne and Greg came to see us because they had heard about our band. And at that point, I was just having Christy. I mean, she was just brand baby new. And so I quit playing altogether. And then Dwayne and Greg formed the Allman Brothers with Dickey and our bass player and Dwayne and Greg and 2 drummers. And I think that was it at that point. So anyway, they started going out playing, and they got a record deal and moved to Macon, Georgia, where Capricorn Records was. So Dickey and I did not get along real well because I was drinking, he was drinking. We'd get in fights, and he'd hit me, and I'd hit him back. So, but I was rough. I mean, I was not a lady at all. I mean, I would get in a fight, and and I was pretty strong, after handling all those horses and lifting bags of feed and being with cows. And so, but I never could beat Dickey up. It was always the other way around. So anyway, say all that. We're good friends now, though. He's getting straightened out, too. So anyway, we had Christy, and then the band got going, and then they all moved to Macon. And then things started going really downhill because they all started getting involved in really serious drugs, hardcore drugs. Everybody started getting tattoos. The ladies in the band all started dabbling around in witchcraft, real satanic type witchcraft. I never really got into all that. I mean, I went as far as buying a set of tarot cards one time, but that was it. I never could quite get into it. But anyway, it got kind of scary. Things were really going downhill. And then their band played a concert up here in North Carolina, and Dickey and I fell in love with North Carolina. So we bought a place, and the relationship just fell apart. And so he moved back down to Macon, and I was just up here working and riding my horses and trail riding and having a good old time. And so one day he called me, and evidently they had bought a big farm. And they all decided they wanted to be cowboys, and they were all going to get horses. So he's watching the horses. Oh, I forgot to feed the horses. Oh, I forgot to put water out for the horses. So he called me. He said, "Would you consider coming down here and working for us and managing the horses?"
This is him and all the Allman brothers. They were all living together on this farm.
Yes.
And they got these certain. Now, you were separated from.
We were
Dickey?
divorced.
You were divorced, but you still talking to Dickey, I guess.
Well, actually, we didn't talk much, but until he called me, and then Christy and I moved down there, and that was, in my thinking, was a wonderful job. Because I got paid for just playing, basically, with the horses, right, which I loved. And so I was in this big horse trading thing. And, I mean, it was wild. And then I started doing drugs down there. And about that time is when Joe and his band from New York, called the Jam Factory, they moved down to Georgia. They wanted to get out of New York, and I think they might have gone to Florida first and then up there. But anyway, they came up to visit the Allman Brothers, and so that's where Joe and I met, and out on the farm. And so we started seeing each other, and it progressed and progressed. And so then we moved off the farm, and we had gone. I didn't tell you this part. I'm sorry. So during that time, Paul McCartney was making an album, Venus and Mars, and his drummer I can't remember if he got fired or quit. But anyway, he didn't have a drummer, so they called J-Mo, who was one of the Allman Brothers drummers, and asked him if he knew anybody that was good. And J-Mo immediately suggested Joe. So Joe flew down to New Orleans, and Paul and Linda fell in love with Joe. I mean, he was hired on the spot. So, and he spent 3 years with Paul, and I was a big part of him not being with Paul anymore, because in the meantime, he and I had gone on vacation in Florida, and I was in the car by myself, and I ended up getting in a really horrendous wreck. And when the fire department police came, they were sure I was dead because of the way the car was mangled. It was around a cement utility pole. A guy was following me, and I think I got scared and gunned the car, and it was a Porsche, so you know how it took off. Yeah. But I didn't see the S-curve, and I hit the pole. So anyway, when they got the jaws of life and got me cut out of the car, they said I moaned, and they realized I was alive, and they couldn't believe it. So they took me to the hospital, and then they couldn't believe that I didn't have any more injuries than I did, but I had a really mangled up leg. So I had to stay there long enough for them to put me in traction so they could do surgery on my leg. And so they did that, and then I came home, and they weren't sure if I was going to walk again. I left in a wheelchair, of course, and went back up to Georgia, and where we lived, and I had a good friend who had just become a Christian. Now, she was one of our drinking buddies, too, but she had become a Christian, and so she started telling me I needed to come to her house to stay, and she'd help me with Joe and Christy and everything. So I did, and about the first couple days I was there, she said, "You got to come with me to this prayer meeting." She said, "You got to meet these people." And I had back in all of those days at the farm, I remember there was one particular night that I was standing outside. It was a real clear night, and I can see it like it was last night. I was so miserable and so depressed and so hopeless, and knew I was going to ruin Christy, and it was just awful. I mean, I contemplated killing myself. And, I mean, it was just bad. And then I couldn't do it because Christy, you know. So, but anyway, I was just depressed. And I remember looking up and crying out, "God, if you're real, please help me, because I don't know how to get out of this mess." And so, back up to Georgia with Peggy, went to her house, and she taught me into going to the prayer meeting. And I met the most precious two couples I've ever met. Well, I've met more since, but back then, and they started telling me about Jesus, and I knew the name. I knew there was supposed to be a God, but I didn't know anything about him, and I certainly didn't know him. And so when they started telling me I could have a relationship with Jesus, I mean, I just believed it. And I asked him to come in my heart. And I mean, as soon as that happened, I mean, they had to pray for me to even get the words out of my mouth. I was so in bondage to all that demonic activity I'd given myself to in Georgia. Or, well, I was still in Georgia, but at the farm in Macon. And so I finally got it out, and when I did, it's like I started feeling things change. And they looked at me and they said, "We really feel like God wants to heal your leg. Do you care if we pray for that?" And at that point, I'm like, I want whatever God has for me. And so they prayed, and you know what? I got my walker, and I walked out of that place holding my walker up in the air, and I never quit walking since. And it was an amazing thing, because, when I got home, Joe and Tommy, Peggy's husband, had gone to a bar in Macon. So they come home, and here I am running up and down the stairs, and I still had 6 weeks before I was supposed to put any weight on my leg at all. And then they were going to see if I could walk. So they came home, and they're looking at me like, "What are you doing? Get off your leg." And so they thought everybody psyched me up and put all this stuff in my head They didn't realize the heart change that had happened and the miracle that God had done. So a couple days later, I made an appointment with a doctor there in Macon who had never seen me because the wreck was in Florida and my doctor was in Florida. And so I went into him, and I wasn't sure what to do. I was afraid he was going to yell at me for not being on the walker, but it was like, well, if I go in on the walker, it's going to be a lie because God healed my leg. And I'm not gonna do that. So I'm going, Jesus, what do I do? And he just said, just trust me, just trust me. And so I walked in there. I didn't take my walker. So I'm sitting in on the table. The lady had x-rayed my leg, and he says, so what are you here for? And I kind of looked at him real dumb, like blah, blah, and I just kind of muttered something like that. He says, are you just here for a follow-up? He kind of helped me out, you know. So I said, yeah, that's it. And so I hopped down he told me to hop down off the table after he'd looked at my x-ray. And I'm thinking, hop down? Oh, okay. So I hopped down and went back with him to look at the x-ray. And Mark, it was the most incredible thing. I'm a nurse now, so I've seen a lot of x-rays. I was also a vet tech, so I saw a lot of those x-rays. But in the x-ray, there were the plates and all the screws and all that stuff, but all around where the break was this cloud-looking thing. And I'm asking him, I said, what is that? He said, that's your leg putting off bone tissue. He said, I've never seen anything like this. A leg put that much, or a bone put that much new bone growth out that fast. And I told him when they'd operated on me and everything. He says, that's incredible. And so I told him that God had healed me. He said he did. And so he confirmed it.
That's great.
So I went back and told everybody, see, God did heal me. So I was excited about that. So, I gotta hurry. So Joe and I were, we were together, but we weren't together. He was in London. And I could not handle London because I'd grown up on a farm.
This is when he's playing with
Paul
he
was
McCartney.
with McCartney at that time.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Did you try to live in London for a little bit with him?
I did. I tried. Excuse me.
But you were saying you grew up on a farm, so London was not
It wasn't
a place
me.
for you at that time.
I couldn't handle being in an apartment. I didn't have anything to do. Christy was there. She didn't have anything to do. We were bored to tears. Mm-hmm. So I kept going back home. But after the wreck and after the healing and everything, I just never went back. And Joe was over there, and he had an experience up on the farm in Scotland with Paul. Paul had a farm up there. Yeah. And he said one night he woke up and he looked out the window and he said he saw these standing stones on the property. Mm-hmm. And, Paul liked odd things, but it scared him really bad. He said all he could feel was this presence of evil. And I know God allowed him to feel that to get him out of there. So Joe went back to London and told Paul and Linda he was leaving the band. And of course everybody was, what? And they were in the middle of an album and everything. But anyway, he left because I was praying for him to get out of there because I knew what it was like. It was terrible.
Was he using drugs?
Yes. When he got in the McCartney band, all of a sudden he had lots of money so he could buy whatever drugs he wanted. And they got really strung out on heroin. Not Paul and Linda. They never did the hard stuff. But he and then the guitar player, Jimmy McCulloch, and they found him overdosed dead after 2 days in his apartment. And I mean, it was so sad. It broke everybody's heart. Because he was a sweet guy, but anyway. So Joe got real strung out on heroin, and so when he got back to Georgia, he didn't know what he was going to do. He was just kind of floundering around, and I was trying to get him help and get him prayer, and because the people I was with knew how to pray. I mean, they prayed strong for me. Yeah. They knew about demonic oppression, and if they hadn't, I don't think I would be here today because I wouldn't have made it. So anyway, they started doing Bible studies with me. So I'd take Joe to them, but it was like it just didn't go in because he was still so addicted. So, see how to nutshell this. Oh, that's what happened. Ray Nino came. He had heard about Joe, and somehow it got out on the airwaves that Joe was a Christian, which he wasn't, because he never made any kind of a commitment. He would try, but it was like his whole heart wasn't in it. He wouldn't surrender was his whole problem. He couldn't just surrender himself to God and just let everything else go. And so he was still on drugs, but Ray came over and decided, well, if I get him in this other environment of Christian music, because Ray had a record company in Nashville, and so he talked Joe into coming over there. So we moved to Nashville, and Joe went out on the road as a Christian, and all he could give was my testimony, because he didn't have one, but he would always give my testimony, how God healed me and all. And so he was out there for a couple of years, but it was just bad. He'd come home off the road, and he'd come in the morning, he'd wake up and say, I'm going to get a newspaper. And then I wouldn't see him for 3 days. And he would have gone to Georgia to get drugs. That's what it was. And so this went on, and we fought and fought and fought with each other. I mean, it was so bad. And it was like every time I thought, I'm going to get a divorce from this guy. He is not going anywhere. But it was like God just restrained me. And so then my dad died, and Ray Nino's dad died about the same time. And I talked Joe into moving to North Carolina because my mom was here. And Ray and Brenda moved to Pennsylvania. And so I was praying Joe out of that Christian record thing, because it was no different than the rock and roll. I mean, they all did the same stuff the people in rock and roll did. So it's like, this is not going to help him. And this music is nothing but the same rock and roll. There's no God in it. And so when we moved to North Carolina, he floundered and floundered and floundered. And so we were there for several years, and we got involved in a small church up there. And Sally and Olaf Carlson had moved down here to Spindale. And so in the meantime, Ray was going to try to help Joe one more time, quote, and offered me a job in the office and said, y'all come up and we'll help Joe. So we moved up to Pennsylvania, and Joe was a mess. I mean, we were both a mess, really, truthfully. One time I was standing there, and it was like this bitterness would want to hit me about all these years we'd wasted. And I remember clearly God saying to me, because I was complaining to God, I keep getting all this bitterness, and now I get it out, and then here it is again, and then here it is again, and then here it is again. And he said to me so clear, what are you going to do when I get Joe completely free and cleaned up, and you have to deal with what's in you? So, I mean, that was a real landmark in my life. And so I kind of just didn't attack Joe so bad anymore. And so one day I was out doing, I got to tell you this miracle, because this was a miracle, and it really saved our marriage at that point. I had been out in the woods all day running fence. I was doing a cross fence for the horses, and I came up. I had completely mucked out the whole barn, cleaned it out, and put all new shavings in it, got in the house and looked down, and my diamond was gone out of my ring. And I was like, that's it. That means I'm supposed to get a divorce. That's it. So I went in and I started getting cleaned up, and all of a sudden I hear Joe out on the porch. He's going, Dayle, is this your diamond? I'm going, what? Because I knew where I'd been all day, and there's no way. And so he comes in, and it was my diamond. And he had found it in the dark, in the horse barn, under a piece of shavings. He had taken the flashlight out and was looking around, and it caught the sparkle. And I know he knew God did that, and it was a memorial for him as well. And so then I knew, I really got anchored then that I was to continue to fight for him. So then we ended up moving up to Pennsylvania with Ray because he talked us into coming up there. And so we got Joe in a teen challenge, and he was doing okay in there. And meantime, Joe had gone on a trip with Ulf Christensen, who was from Sweden, and Ulf knew Sam and Jane. So he's telling Sam and Jane about this place down here. And Sally and Olaf, that I mentioned a minute ago, had told me about this place down here when they came back through.
Yeah, Word of Faith Fellowship.
Yes, Sam and Jane Whaley and Word of Faith. And so I was like, I have got to get down there, but we went to Pennsylvania, so we didn't come then. So anyway, Ray and Ulf came down, and he met Sam and Jane and loved it. So Ray and I came down with another man to a seminar that May, and I loved it. I was about half dead from everything when I got here. And they prayed for me, and it was like life came back in me again. And so I went back home, and I was telling Joe, and he got excited, because he was off the drugs then. And so he said something to him at Teen Challenge about it, and they made him leave.
Yeah. So
I went
where
and
did
got
he go
him.
then?
He went back to Allentown, where we were in Pennsylvania, and then he and Ray and Brenda came to a youth seminar, and then that August, we all moved here, and then you and I were in the same Bible class.
That's right, and that you were telling me that was 1990, that you and Joe moved here. We moved here at the same time, I remember
yes.
all of you coming in, and Ray and Brenda. And so tell us about what happened when you moved here, you and Joe, and what the things that God's
Yes.
done for you.
Well, the whole time after I got born again that night in Georgia, back years before that, in 1977 actually is when all that went on at that prayer meeting. And so I have been really crying out to God, there's got to be more. It was like I would go to these different churches, but it was like they were comfortable where they were. And I kept seeing scriptures like in Hebrews 6, where it says we are going to go on to more advanced teaching, and we're not going to keep laying these same foundations over and over and over. And I'm going, people are not hungry to keep going. I want to know more of Jesus, like Philippians 3 says, to press on to the higher calling. And I'm going to let me read that to you, because it's really, really powerful. And this is kind of my story. I got 1 minute. It says, help me, Lord. I had 3. Here we go. It says, yet furthermore, I count everything as lost compared to the possession of the priceless privilege of the overwhelming preciousness, the surpassing worth, and supreme advantage of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, and of progressively becoming more deeply and intimately acquainted with him, of perceiving and recognizing and understanding him more fully and clearly. And for his sake I have lost everything and consider it all to be rubbish, in order that I may again win Christ. And if y'all want to read that, it's in Philippians 3, verse 8 through 11. But for time's sake, I'm just going to say, and that's what I found in Word of Faith. That's all they taught us, was how to know Jesus and how to walk in relationship with him every single day. It's the most loving church I have ever been in my life.
And thank you for sharing that, Dayle. What a powerful testimony. God truly had his hand on you through all of these amazing experiences, and God saw a place in your heart where you're going to come to him. And your word is so encouraging about Joe as well. Like you said when you started off, it's an encouragement to know that maybe you have people in your family who are struggling, but you did not let go of hope with your husband Joe, and here he is now serving God with you together after all these years. And you came here in 1990, and here you are with Joe, and both of you serving God. I know both of you sing on the praise and worship team in our church, and we're grateful that you both came. So
and we're grateful too.
Thank you again for listening to us today. This is Word of Faith Responds. If you'd like to go to our website to hear more of our radio programs, you can go to wordoffaithfellowship.org, and you'll see the radio program link. Thank you, and have a good day.